The mansion gates rose taller than anything Sophia had ever stood in front of. Black iron twisted into shapes that looked almost alive in the late afternoon light, and beyond them she could see white flowers strung along a stone path, like something out of a painting she'd never be allowed to walk through. She hadn't eaten in 4 days. Not properly. A stale heel of bread 2 mornings ago, a handful of berries she'd picked from a hedge outside town, and immediately regretted because they'd made her stomach cramp for hours afterward. Her legs had carried her this far, on nothing but momentum, and the stubborn refusal to lie down in a ditch somewhere and let the world finish what it had started. She hadn't meant to come here. She'd been walking toward the next town over, the one with the mill that sometimes hired extra hands during harvest, and the road had simply run out of road, curving instead toward this enormous stone house with its gates and its flowers and its distant sound of music drifting on the wind. A wedding, she realized dimly. Someone very important was getting married today. The thought arrived, and then dissolved, the way most thoughts had been dissolving lately, replaced by the singular white-hot fact of her own hunger, which had stopped feeling like hunger somewhere around yesterday and started feeling like something closer to drowning. She gripped the iron bars of the gate to steady herself, black spots crowding the edges of her vision, and told herself she just needed a moment. Just a moment to catch her breath before she kept walking, before she found somewhere to sit that wasn't directly in front of a stranger's wedding. The moment didn't come. Her knees simply stopped agreeing to hold her up, and the last thing Sophia remembered clearly was the gate's cold iron sliding out of her grip, the flowers blurring into a smear of white, and the ground rushing up to meet her with none of the gentleness the flowers had promised. She didn't feel herself hit the ground. What she felt, distantly, in whatever part of her mind was still awake enough to register anything at all, was the sudden absence of falling. Something had caught her, something solid and cold and impossibly strong, an arm sliding beneath her before her body could finish its collapse, and a voice above her, low and urgent, speaking words she couldn't quite piece together into meaning. She's burning up. No, she's freezing. Someone get another voice, higher, sharper, cutting through the first one with an edge of something close to outrage. Matthias, the ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Whatever this is, surely someone else can Cordelia. The first voice again, quieter now, but carrying a weight that silenced whatever else the second voice had been about to say. There is a woman dying on my doorstep. The ceremony can wait. Sophia's eyes fluttered open for just a second, just long enough to catch a fractured, sideways glimpse of a face above her sharp, striking, framed by dark hair that fell loose around broad shoulders, eyes the color of something between amber and firelight, fixed entirely on her with an intensity that felt, even through the fog of her own starvation, like being seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. Then, the darkness took her again, and she didn't fight it. The last thing she registered was being lifted, easily, like her weight meant nothing at all, and the sound of gasps rippling outward through a crowd of wedding guests she would never actually see. All of them watching in stunned silence as the groom carried a collapsed stranger through his own wedding gates, instead of walking down the aisle waiting for him on the other side. She had no memory of the walk through the mansion, no memory of the gasps growing quieter behind her as the man carrying her put distance between them and the crowd. What little awareness remained came in fractured pieces the smell of beeswax candles, the cool press of marble beneath whatever surface he'd finally laid her on, the murmur of a voice giving orders in a tone that expected no argument. Broth, not bread, not yet. Her stomach won't hold it. And someone find Ilsa. Tell her to bring Matthias. A different voice now, older, careful, the kind of voice that had clearly spent years learning how to say difficult things to this particular man without provoking him. The guests are still standing in the garden. Then let them stand. No hesitation at all in the answer. No consideration given to whatever social catastrophe was currently unfolding among the white flowers outside. I'll speak with Cordelia and her family once this woman is stable. Not before. You understand what today was supposed to. I understand exactly what today was supposed to be. Something had hardened in his voice. An edge Sophia's fading consciousness couldn't quite place meaning to yet, only that it silenced the older voice completely. Get the broth. Now, Sophia drifted somewhere beneath the surface of full awareness for what might have been minutes, or might have been an hour, vaguely aware of hands checking her pulse, of a cool cloth pressed to her forehead, of that same low voice occasionally murmuring something close to her ear that she couldn't decipher, but that nonetheless made some small, exhausted part of her feel, absurdly, safe. When her eyes finally opened properly, she was lying on a bed far softer than anything she'd slept on in longer than she cared to remember, in a room lit by warm lamplight instead of the gray afternoon she'd collapsed into. A man sat in a chair pulled close to the bedside, elbows on his knees, watching her with an expression of such focused, quiet concern that for a disoriented moment, Sophia genuinely wondered if she'd already died. And this was simply what came after. "There you are," he said softly, and something in his voice suggested he'd been waiting a long time to say exactly that. Where Sophia's voice came out cracked, barely a whisper, her throat dry as old paper. "Where am I?" "Safe," he said it simply, without embellishment, and reached for a cup on the bedside table, helping her sit up just enough to drink without spilling. Small sips. Your body isn't ready for much more than that yet. The water tasted better than anything she could remember drinking, cool and clean, and she drank until he gently pulled the cup away. Not unkindly, just firmly, the way someone handles something fragile they intend to keep intact. "You collapsed outside my gates," he said, once she'd settled back against the pillows. "Do you remember that?" A little. She remembered flowers. She remembered music. She remembered, distantly, a voice cutting through fog like it had the authority to command her body to keep breathing. There was a wedding. Something crossed his face, there and gone too fast for her exhausted mind to name it. There was. I ruined it. The realization arrived slowly, weighted with a shame that felt disproportionate given she'd been unconscious for whatever came after, but shame rarely bothered with proportion. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to get to the mill in the next town. I didn't know there'd be you. Didn't ruin anything." His voice had gone quiet, careful, like he was choosing each word with more deliberation than the sentence seemed to require. "You collapsed from hunger on my doorstep. That isn't something to apologize for. How long was I? 3 hours. Ilsa's been in twice to check on you. She says with proper food and rest, you'll recover fully, though it'll take a few days before your body stops treating every meal like an emergency." He studied her face in a way that felt less clinical than curious, like he was trying to work out something about her that had nothing to do with medicine. "When did you last eat properly? Not scraps. An actual meal." Sophia had to think, and the thinking itself felt like an effort, like reaching backward through fog for something that had happened to a different, less exhausted version of herself. 6 days ago. Maybe 7. There was a stew at the shelter in Millbrook before they closed the doors for the season. 7 days. He repeated it like the number itself offended him personally. And before that? Does it matter? "It matters to me." He said it plainly, without drama, but something in the way he said it made Sophia's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "What's your name?" "Sophia. Sophia." He tested the name like he was committing it to some permanent place in his memory. "I'm Matthias." She hesitated, glancing toward the door, toward whatever remained of the wedding she'd apparently interrupted. Should you be somewhere else right now? With her? With whoever you were supposed to marry today." Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his expression settling into something Sophia couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like relief mixed with an exhaustion far older than the last 3 hours could account for. "I should be a great many places I have no intention of going right now," he said finally. "You're the first thing all day that's felt like the right place to be." Sophia didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and Matthias, apparently sensing she'd reached the limit of what her body could handle for one conversation, rose to fetch the broth he'd ordered earlier, leaving her alone with a room full of warm lamplight and a question she didn't yet have the strength to ask out loud. What exactly had she interrupted? And what, if anything, was he going to do about it now? He returned a few minutes later carrying a tray himself, no servant trailing behind him, which struck Sophia as strange for a man who apparently owned a house this size, though she was too tired to examine the thought further. He set the tray down carefully and helped her sit up again, propping pillows behind her with more gentleness than she expected from someone with hands that looked like they could easily crush stone. "Small spoonfuls," he said, handing her the bowl instead of feeding her himself, which she appreciated more than she had words to explain. "Your stomach needs to remember what food is before you overwhelm it." The broth was simple, plain, clearly chosen deliberately over anything richer, and it tasted, to Sophia's starved senses, like the single best thing she had ever eaten in her entire life. She ate slowly, aware of him watching her with a stillness that should have felt unsettling, and somehow didn't. "You didn't answer my question," she said between spoonfuls, feeling steadier with each one. "About the wedding." "No," Matthias agreed. "I didn't. Are you going to?" He considered her for a long moment, firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more deliberate. "Eventually. Tonight, probably, once you've eaten properly and slept. It's not a short conversation, and you've earned the right to finish your soup first, without me making it complicated." Sophia let that sit, too tired and too hungry to push further, and focused instead on the broth, on the warmth spreading slowly through her chest, on the strange, quiet safety of a room she had no business being in at all. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve something," she said eventually, setting the empty bowl aside. "Maybe I am." Matthias took the bowl from her hands, his fingers brushing hers briefly, deliberately careful. 7 days without a proper meal, and you still apologize to me for interrupting my wedding before you asked where you were or what had happened to you. That's not nothing, Sophia. Most people in your position would have asked about themselves first. "Habit," she said, quieter than she meant to. "You learn to worry about the damage you've caused before you worry about yourself. It's usually smaller and easier to fix." Something in his expression shifted, gentler now, and he didn't press further, simply nodded once like he'd filed the answer away somewhere important. "Sleep," he said instead. "We'll talk properly once you've rested. I'm not going anywhere." Outside the bedroom, in a parlor Sophia couldn't see, and would learn about only later, the wedding guests had not, in fact, dispersed quietly. Cordelia Vane stood in the center of the room, still wearing her wedding gown, ivory silk pooling around her feet like she'd simply refused to acknowledge that the ceremony wasn't happening. Her expression a controlled fury that only someone who'd spent a lifetime perfecting composure could manage. "Explain to me," she said, the moment Matthias entered the room, "exactly what I am supposed to tell my father, who flew in from 3 territories away to watch his daughter marry into the strongest bloodline in the region, and instead watched his daughter's groom carry an unconscious beggar through the garden like she mattered more than an alliance 6 months in the making." She collapsed, Cordelia, from hunger. "On my doorstep." Matthias kept his voice level, though something tight had entered it, the sound of patience being spent carefully rather than freely given. "I wasn't going to step over a dying woman to keep to a schedule. You could have had someone else carry her. I could have. I didn't want to. The admission landed in the room with more weight than either of them seemed to expect, and Cordelia's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, something raw and startled showing through before she smoothed it back into place. You didn't want to, she repeated. Matthias, we have spent 6 months building this arrangement. My family's territories, your bloodline's strength, a treaty that keeps 3 courts from tearing each other apart over hunting grounds neither of us actually wants to fight over. That is what today was supposed to secure, not whatever sentiment you're currently indulging over some stranger who fainted at your gate. I'm aware of what today was supposed to secure. Matthias's jaw had tightened, the muscle working there the way it did when he was holding something back with real effort. I agreed to this marriage because it was practical, because our families needed the alliance, and I told myself practicality was reason enough to build a life around. And now, I carried a starving stranger through my own wedding without hesitating for even a second, and I haven't regretted it once since. Not even watching you stand there in that dress looking at me like I've betrayed something sacred. He exhaled, something in his posture settling, like a decision that had been circling him for months had finally landed somewhere solid. I think that tells both of us everything we actually need to know about whether this marriage was ever going to work. Cordelia's father, a broad, silver-haired man who'd been standing silently by the window through the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous calm of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Careful, Matthias. This isn't only a wedding you're threatening to walk away from. It's a treaty. Break it carelessly, and you'll find out exactly how quickly allies become enemies in this business. I'm not being careless, Lord Vane. I'm being honest, possibly for the first time in 6 months. Matthias met the older man's gaze without flinching. Give me tonight. I owe your family a real conversation, not one shouted across a parlor while your daughter is still standing in her wedding gown, but I won't pretend, not for 1 more hour, that I intended to walk down that aisle with any real certainty in my chest. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes something breaking, and Cordelia, for the first time since Matthias had entered, looked less angry than simply deeply tired, the way someone looks when a suspicion they'd been carrying for months has finally been confirmed out loud. I knew, she said finally, quieter now, the fury draining out of her voice like something she no longer had the energy to hold on to. Somewhere underneath all the planning and the fittings and the guest lists, I think I've known for weeks that you were going through the motions of this, the same way I was. I told myself it didn't matter, that plenty of good marriages start as arrangements and grow into something real later. I still believe that's possible, for some people. But not for us, Matthias said. Not unkindly. Not for us. Cordelia allowed herself something close to a rueful smile, brittle but genuine. I watched your face the moment that woman collapsed, Matthias. I've never once seen you look at me the way you looked at a total stranger lying unconscious on your doorstep. That's not something I can compete with, and honestly I'm not certain I want to try. Lord Vane's expression had shifted too, the dangerous calm softening slightly into something more measured, more calculating in a different direction now. The treaty still needs addressing, he said, regardless of what happens between the two of you personally. It does, Matthias agreed, and I intend to address it properly, tonight, with terms that don't require either of our families to pretend a marriage neither of us wanted was ever the only path to peace between our territories. Give me until morning to draft something worth both our signatures. Cordelia studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, gathering the heavy silk of her gown with a composure that had clearly cost her considerable effort to reclaim. Morning, then, she said. But Matthias, whoever she is, the woman upstairs. I hope she's worth what you just did to get to her. So do I, Matthias said quietly, and meant it more than he'd expected to. He watched Cordelia and her father leave through the great front doors, the last of the wedding guests trailing quietly out behind them into the fading evening light, the white flowers along the path already beginning to wilt without ceremony left to justify them. For the first time in months, the house felt less like a stage set for an arrangement he'd never fully believed in, and more like something that might actually belong to him again. Sophia woke to sunlight for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, warm and golden through gauzy curtains, and for a disoriented moment she simply lay there, blinking at an unfamiliar ceiling, trying to piece together how she'd ended up somewhere this soft. Then, it came back in a rush: the gates, the collapse, the low, urgent voice that had caught her before she hit the ground. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened, and an older woman stepped inside carrying a fresh tray, her expression kind, but assessing in a way that made Sophia feel, not unpleasantly, thoroughly examined. "You're awake properly this time," the woman said. "Good, I'm Ilsa. I looked after you last night while His Majesty dealt with more complicated matters downstairs." His Majesty. Sophia sat up slowly, testing her strength, relieved to find her body responding with something closer to normal effort than the boneless exhaustion of the day before. That's what people call him? Matthias? Among other things. Ilsa set the tray down and began checking Sophia's pulse with brisk, practiced efficiency. "You're stronger already. Colors returned to your face. How does your stomach feel? Hollow, but not painful. Not like yesterday. That's the correct amount of hollow for someone 2 meals into recovery." Ilsa nodded, satisfied, and gestured toward the tray. "Eat slowly. There's more solid food today, but don't rush it just because it looks tempting." Sophia ate carefully, aware of Ilsa watching with the same clinical attentiveness Matthias had shown the night before, and found herself asking the question that had been sitting uneasily in her chest since she'd woken. The wedding. Did I ruin something that can't be fixed? Ilsa considered the question for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. "That's not really mine to answer," she said finally. "But I will tell you this much. In 3 centuries of knowing that man, I have never once seen him abandon an obligation as significant as a treaty marriage for anything less than a reason he considered genuinely worth the cost. Whatever happened yesterday, he didn't do it lightly, and he certainly didn't do it because you asked him to. You were unconscious the entire time." The word settled somewhere in Sophia's chest she wasn't quite ready to examine closely, and she focused instead on finishing her breakfast, grateful when a knock at the door interrupted whatever else Ilsa might have been about to say. Matthias entered without waiting for an answer, dressed more simply than Sophia expected for a man who owned a house this size, dark shirt open at the collar, his long hair loose around his shoulders instead of pulled back the way she vaguely remembered from the night before. He looked, she thought, less like a king, and more like someone who'd slept poorly and hadn't bothered pretending otherwise. "You look better," he said, something in his voice easing visibly at the sight of her sitting up, eating, clearly recovering. "I feel better. Thank you for all of this." Sophia gestured vaguely at the room, the tray, the entire strange, soft world she'd woken up inside of. "I still don't understand why." Matthias pulled the same chair from the night before closer to the bed, and sat, elbows on his knees, studying her with an expression that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, almost uncertain. "Neither do I. Fully," he admitted. "But I intend to figure it out, if you're willing to stay long enough for both of us to try." Sophia set her cup down carefully, buying herself a moment before answering. "I don't have anywhere to stay long enough for anything. That's rather the point of how you found me." "I know." Something in his expression shifted, gentler now, less uncertain. "Which is precisely why I'm asking instead of assuming. Ilsa tells me you're recovering well, physically, but I imagine there's more to your situation than simple bad luck on the road to a mill in the next town." Sophia looked down at her hands, at fingers still thinner than she liked, nails bitten short from months of worry she hadn't had the luxury of setting down even for an hour. "My family's farm failed 2 seasons ago. bad harvest, then worse debt. My father died last winter, my mother the winter before that, and I've been moving from town to town since, taking whatever work exists for however long it lasts before it doesn't anymore. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you describe a fact you've long since stopped expecting sympathy for. The mill in the next town was supposed to be work through harvest season. I don't know if it still is. I don't know if I'll make it there in any condition to ask. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his expression that Sophia couldn't quite read. You don't have to go to the mill, he said finally. Not today. Not until you're strong enough to walk there without collapsing again. I can't stay here indefinitely, Matthias. Whatever this is, whatever yesterday was, I'm not someone you owe anything to beyond what you've already given me. Perhaps not, he agreed. But I'd like the chance to decide that for myself, rather than have you decide it for both of us before I've had a proper conversation with you that doesn't involve a spoon and a bowl of broth. Despite herself, Sophia felt something that might have been the beginning of a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. That's a strangely specific complaint. I've had a strange few days, Matthias said, and for the first time since she'd woken, something like real warmth broke through the careful composure he'd been holding since he walked in. Over the following days, Sophia's strength returned in slow, measurable increments, each one marked by some small milestone Ilse noted with clinical satisfaction, walking the length of the hallway unassisted, climbing the stairs to the garden without needing to stop halfway, eating a full meal without her stomach, protesting the abundance of it. Matthias visited every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for the better part of an afternoon, and their conversations gradually shed the careful formality of that first morning, settling into something easier, something that felt, disconcertingly, like the beginning of friendship building itself out of circumstances that had no business producing anything so gentle. Tell me something true, he said one afternoon, the two of them sitting in the garden where roses climbed a trellis in defiance of the season, a blanket draped over Sophia's lap despite her insistence she no longer needed one. Something you haven't told anyone else. Sophia considered the request, turning it over. I used to hate this garden of yours before I ever saw it. From the road, I mean. Walking past estates like this one. Seeing flowers blooming out of season while I was calculating whether I could afford bread for another 2 days. I used to think people who owned gardens like this couldn't possibly understand what real hunger felt like. And now? Now I'm sitting in one, being fed broth by the man who owns it, and I still don't know what to do with the anger I used to carry about places like this. She glanced at him, half expecting offense, finding instead only quiet, patient attention. I'm sorry. That's probably not what you meant by something true. It's exactly what I meant. Matthias's voice had gone thoughtful, unhurried. I'd rather know the truth of what you actually think about my house and my garden and everything they represent than have you tell me something comfortable just because I fed you broth for a week. Sophia laughed, surprised into it, the sound coming easier than it had and longer than she cared to calculate. You're strange, for a vampire king. I've been told that more than once this week alone. Something in his expression sobered slightly. Your turn to hear something true, if you'll allow it. I agreed to marry Cordelia because it was practical, because two powerful families joining meant peace instead of war between territories that had spent decades circling each other, looking for reasons to fight. I told myself that was reason enough. I'd spent 3 centuries telling myself practicality was the only reasonable foundation to build anything on, since I'd lost the version of myself capable of building on anything softer a very long time ago. What changed? You collapsed on my doorstep 4 days before my wedding, and I realized, watching you fall, that I would rather step over every single guest in that garden than let you hit the ground. He said it simply, without theatrics, the kind of admission that clearly cost him more composure than his even tone suggested. That's not something I expected to feel for a stranger. I'm still working out what to do with it. Sophia's chest tightened around something that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling she'd trained herself out of expecting from the world months ago. What if it's just gratitude? Or guilt for interrupting something important? It isn't. Matthias met her eyes with a certainty that left no room for the doubt she'd been trying to offer him as an easy exit. I've had 3 centuries to learn the difference between guilt and something real. Sophia, this is the second one. She didn't have an answer ready for that, so she sat with it instead, the late afternoon light warming the roses around them, and found she wasn't in any hurry to fill the silence with something safer. Cordelia's father wanted the treaty settled by morning, she said eventually, because it felt easier than sitting inside the weight of what he'd just told her. Did that happen? I never asked. I've been too afraid of the answer. Honestly, it's settled, Matthias said. Differently than either family originally intended, but settled. Lord Vane and I signed terms that secure the peace without requiring a marriage neither of us actually wanted. It took some convincing, and a fair amount of Ilsa's diplomatic patience, which she's reminded me of at least 3 times since. Was Cordelia angry? Hurt, more than angry. By the end of it, I think some part of her was relieved too, though she'd never admit that to my face. He shrugged, something rueful in the gesture. We weren't cruel to each other, at least. That matters more to me than I expected it to. I'm glad, Sophia said, and meant it, surprised at how much she meant it. I didn't want to be the reason someone else got hurt, just because I happened to collapse at the wrong gate on the wrong afternoon. You weren't the reason, Matthias said quietly. You were the moment I finally admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding for months. Those aren't the same thing, whatever it might feel like from where you're sitting. Sophia let the words settle, watching a bee move lazily between roses that had no business blooming this deep into autumn, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she wasn't bracing for whatever came next. She was simply sitting in a garden, warm and fed and listened to, beside a man who seemed determined to make sure she stayed exactly that way for as long as she'd let him, and for once, that felt like enough of a plan for one afternoon. 2 weeks into her recovery, Sophia found Ilsa waiting for her in the hallway with an expression that suggested she'd been standing there for some time, deciding exactly how to phrase whatever came next. He's asked me to offer you a position, Ilsa said, without preamble. Officially, running the household ledgers. He mentioned you'd managed your family's farm accounts before everything fell apart, and apparently that qualifies you for considerably more than most of the staff currently handling his finances. And unofficially? Ilsa's mouth twitched, something almost fond in the expression. Unofficially, I imagine it's an excuse to keep you here, without either of you having to admit that's the actual reason. Sophia felt heat climb her cheeks despite herself. That's a very generous unofficial theory. I've known that man 3 centuries, Ilsa said. I recognize the particular flavor of denial he's currently indulging in. It's the same flavor you're indulging in, for what it's worth, standing there blushing at me in the hallway. Sophia accepted the position 2 days later, in a small study off the main library, Matthias watching from the doorway with an expression he clearly thought was more neutral than it actually was. You're hovering, Sophia said, without looking up from the ledger she'd been handed. I'm supervising. You're hovering while pretending to supervise. Matthias crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her desk, abandoning the pretense entirely. Fine, I'm hovering. I wanted to see your face when you looked at these numbers properly for the first time. Sophia glanced up, curious despite herself, and found the numbers considerably more disordered than she expected for a house this well run. These are a mess, Matthias. Whoever's been keeping these accounts has been rounding everything for years, just to avoid dealing with the actual totals. That would be my previous steward, who retired last spring and left considerably more chaos behind than anyone realized until now. Something like relief crossed his face. I've been dreading someone finally having to untangle it. I'm oddly pleased it's you. You say that like you already trust my judgment on centuries of household finances. I trust plenty about your judgment already, Matthias said, quieter now, something in his tone shifting the conversation onto ground that felt less safely professional than a moment ago. You walked 6 days on almost nothing rather than beg for charity you didn't think you'd earned. You apologized for interrupting my wedding before you asked what had happened to you. You've spent 2 weeks in my house being fed and cared for, and you still insist on working for it, rather than accepting kindness freely offered. That tells me considerably more than a ledger ever could. Sophia set her pen down, meeting his eyes properly for the first time since he'd sat down. You keep saying things like that. Things that sound like you're building toward something bigger than household accounts. I am, Matthias admitted. I've been building toward it for 2 weeks now, if I'm honest, ever since that first morning you woke up and apologized to me before asking where you were. And you haven't said it yet, because I wanted you strong enough. First, to say no if that's the honest answer. I didn't want to ask anything of a woman who was still recovering from starvation and gratitude enough that she might say yes to things she didn't actually want, simply because I'd been kind to her. He held her gaze steadily. You're strong now. Strong enough to tell me exactly what you think, whatever that turns out to be. Sophia's heart was beating faster than the conversation should have warranted, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she already knew her answer, had known it for days if she was honest with herself, waiting only for him to ask the actual question, instead of circling it with ledgers and careful patience. Ask me then, she said. Whatever it is, I'm ready to hear it properly. Matthias rose from his chair, crossing the small distance between them, and knelt beside her desk so they were level with each other, an echo of the way he'd once knelt beside her sickbed to check whether she was strong enough to sit up on her own. I don't want you managing my household because I feel responsible for you, he said quietly. I want you here because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, watching you argue with disordered ledgers and steal roses from my garden when you think no one's watching, I've fallen in love with you more completely than I ever managed to fall in love with an arrangement built on treaties and territory. I'm not offering you a position, Sophia. I'm asking whether you'd consider staying because I want you here, not because you have nowhere else to go. Sophia's breath caught somewhere in her chest, the weight of the last 2 weeks settling into something that finally made sense. You noticed the roses. I notice everything about you. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, softening the intensity of the moment just enough that she could breathe again. That wasn't quite the part of the confession I expected you to focus on. I'm working up to the rest, Sophia said, something unsteady and joyful breaking through in her voice. Give me a moment. Nobody's asked me to stay anywhere in over a year, let alone stay because they wanted me there instead of simply tolerating me until something more convenient came along. Take all the time you need, Matthias said, reaching for her hand where it rested on the desk, his fingers curling around hers with a gentleness that had become entirely familiar over the past 2 weeks. I intend to still be kneeling here whenever you're ready to answer. Sophia's answer, when it finally came, was simpler than either of them expected, a hand cupping his jaw, drawing him up from where he knelt, and a kiss that said considerably more than the words she'd been struggling to find. Word of the household's new arrangement spread through the estate with the particular speed reserved for the kind of gossip staff find genuinely delightful rather than scandalous, and within days Sophia found herself greeted each morning by servants whose warmth felt entirely different from the wary curiosity she'd been met with during her first week of recovery. Not everyone received the news with the same delight. Lord Vane arrived unannounced a month later, his expression carrying the same careful calculations Sophia remembered from the brief, tense conversation she'd overheard secondhand about the cancelled wedding, though this time his attention was fixed directly on her. So this is the woman who ended a treaty marriage, he said, without preamble. studying Sophia across the length of the parlor with an assessment she found difficult not to bristle under. I confess, I expected someone more remarkable, Lord Vane. Matthias's voice carried a warning edge Sophia hadn't heard directed at anyone since the day of the wedding itself. You're welcome in my house, but not to speak to Sophia that way. I meant no insult, only honest observation. Vane's gaze didn't waver, though something in his posture suggested he was recalibrating whatever assumption he'd walked in carrying. My daughter is recovering, slowly, from a humiliation she didn't deserve, in front of guests who will discuss it in every court in this region for years to come. I came here expecting to find the reason worth that cost. I find, instead, a woman who was, by all accounts, starving on a roadside a month ago. I was, Sophia said, before Matthias could respond on her behalf, something steady settling into her voice despite the way her pulse had picked up. I was starving and desperate, and I collapsed at a gate I had no business collapsing at. I understand exactly how that looks to you, Lord Vane, and I understand exactly what it cost your daughter's pride to watch her groom carry a stranger past her on what should have been the happiest day of her arranged life. Something in Vane's expression shifted, surprise flickering behind the careful composure. But I'd ask you to consider something else. Sophia continued, her voice gaining steadiness with each word. Your daughter and Matthias were building a marriage on territory and treaties. On practicality, neither of them actually wanted underneath the arrangement. I didn't take anything away from Cordelia that was ever truly hers to keep. I simply happened to be the reason the truth surfaced a few weeks earlier than it might have otherwise, likely on the actual wedding night instead of a garden path. The room went quiet, and for a long moment Vane simply studied her, something recalculating visibly behind his eyes. You're more remarkable than I expected, he said finally, something almost like respect entering his tone. Cordelia said something similar, actually, the week after the ceremony collapsed. She said she suspected the marriage had been hollow long before you ever arrived at the gate, and that watching it end the way it did, however humiliating, spared her years of discovering that hollowness slowly, instead of all at once. I'm glad she feels that way, Sophia said, meaning it. I never wanted to be the reason anyone was hurt. Then, perhaps, Vane said, glancing between Sophia and Matthias with something that looked, cautiously, like acceptance forming, we should discuss what an actual alliance between our families might look like now, built on terms that don't require a marriage neither party wanted in the first place. My territories still value peace with yours, Matthias, whatever shape that peace ultimately takes. Matthias's hand found Sophia's, steady and certain. I'd welcome that conversation, Lord Vane. On terms built honestly this time, instead of convenience dressed up as romance. Lord Vane stayed through dinner, a considerably less tense affair than Sophia had expected, given how the conversation had opened, and by the time he departed that evening, something in his manner toward her had shifted into a grudging, genuine warmth she hadn't anticipated at all. He liked you, Matthias said afterward, the two of them standing on the front steps, watching Vane's carriage disappear down the long drive. He tolerated me. There's a difference. With Lord Vane, tolerance is the highest compliment he offers anyone outside his own family. Matthias slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her against him with an ease that had become natural over the past month. You handled him better than I expected. Better than I would have, honestly, if our positions had been reversed. I've spent a lot of years being underestimated by people who assumed my circumstances told them everything worth knowing about my character, Sophia said. It turns out that's useful practice for standing your ground against territorial lords who show up expecting to find someone unremarkable. You are the furthest thing from unremarkable I've encountered in 3 centuries, Matthias said, pressing a kiss to her temple. And Sophia let herself lean into him fully, watching the last of the evening light fade over grounds that had started, slowly and improbably, to feel like somewhere she actually belonged, in a life she hadn't dared imagine for herself even a month before. Not every reaction to the cancelled wedding proved as gracious as Lord Vane's eventual acceptance. Word had spread through the vampire courts within weeks, the story growing more embellished with every retelling, until Sophia barely recognized herself in the versions whispered at gatherings. She wasn't invited to the starving peasant girl who'd bewitched a king out of a treaty marriage, the calculating opportunist who'd staged her own collapse to secure a fortune she hadn't earned. "You're not actually reading that," Matthias said one evening, finding her in the library with a letter clutched in one hand, her expression carefully neutral in the particular way that told him she was working very hard to appear unbothered. "Someone thought I should see it." Sophia handed him the letter, unsigned, the handwriting deliberately anonymous. "Apparently there's a faction among the older bloodlines who consider my presence here an insult to 3 centuries of careful breeding and alliance building. They've suggested, quite politely, that I consider how much simpler everyone's life would be if I simply disappeared back to whatever roadside I came from." Matthias's expression darkened as he read, something dangerous moving behind his usually composed features. "Who sent this? I don't know. It doesn't matter, does it? There will always be someone who thinks I don't belong here, Matthias. I collapsed outside your gates from hunger. I didn't arrive with a bloodline or a dowry or 3 centuries of careful alliance building behind me. Some people are never going to see past that, whatever else I bring to this house. It matters to me who's threatening you." He set the letter down with more force than necessary. "This isn't simply gossip anymore, Sophia. This reads like something closer to intimidation. What would you do if you found them? Handle it. Properly, through the courts, the way any legitimate grievance should be handled, rather than let anonymous cowards threaten someone I love from behind unsigned letters." His jaw had tightened, the same dangerous stillness she remembered from the day he'd faced down Lord Vane on her behalf. "You deserve better than this, and I intend to make certain you get it." Sophia reached for his hand, steadying him the way he'd steadied her that first terrifying night. "I appreciate that. I do. But I also need you to understand something. I've spent most of my adult life being told, in one way or another, that I don't belong wherever I happen to be standing. This isn't new, Matthias. It's just wearing a more elaborate coat this time. That doesn't mean you should have to simply endure it." "No," she agreed. "But it does mean I'm not going to fall apart over an unsigned letter from someone too cowardly to put their name behind their own opinion. I collapsed once, from actual hunger, actual desperation. I'm not going to collapse again over words from someone hiding in the shadows of a court I never asked to join." Something in Matthias's expression shifted, admiration breaking through the anger. "You're remarkable, you know. I don't think I tell you that often enough." "You tell me constantly," Sophia said, a small smile finally breaking through her careful composure. "I just don't always believe it as easily as you seem to. But I'm working on that." "Take your time," Matthias said, echoing words he'd said to her once before. In this same room, kneeling beside a desk full of disordered ledgers that had somehow led them exactly here. "I intend to keep telling you until you believe it completely, however long that takes." The letter, as it turned out, marked the opening move of something more organized than either of them initially realized. Ilsa brought word 2 days later that a small faction calling itself the Old Bloods had been meeting quietly in the Eastern Territories. Their grievance not merely Sophia's presence, but the precedent it set a vampire king, choosing a starving human stranger over a carefully arranged alliance, publicly, without shame or apology, and apparently intending to make his intentions permanent. "They're not dangerous yet," Ilsa said, laying out what she'd learned in Matthias's study with the same clinical precision she brought to everything else. "But they're gathering support faster than I'd like, mostly among the older families who never fully accepted your father's more progressive policies toward human alliances to begin with. If they gain enough voices, they could force a formal hearing questioning your fitness to continue ruling with a human companion at your side." "Let them try," Matthias said. though something tight had entered his voice. "I'd rather we didn't wait to find out how far they're willing to go," Ilsa said. "I'd rather we were prepared." Sophia, listening quietly from the chair by the window, felt the familiar cold weight of danger settling back into a life that had only just begun to feel steady, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, that safety in this world seemed to come with an expiration date built into every quiet, happy moment she'd been allowed. "What would a formal hearing actually mean?" she asked, keeping her voice steadier than she felt. "For either of us. Practically? Delay, at best," Ilsa said honestly. Public scrutiny, endless questioning of Matthias's judgment, possibly demands that he prove his continued fitness to rule through some display of strength the old bloods would design specifically to be difficult. At worst, if enough voices align against him, it could mean a challenge to his crown itself. "Then we make certain it doesn't come to that," Matthias said, his hand finding Sophia's across the small space between their chairs, steady despite the tension visibly building behind his eyes. "Whatever it takes." The formal challenge came 3 weeks later, delivered with the cold ceremony vampire courts reserved for their most serious grievances, a sealed letter bearing 7 signatures, demanding a hearing before the full regional council to determine whether Matthias's judgment, demonstrably compromised by what the letter called an unprecedented and destabilizing human attachment, rendered him unfit to continue holding his territories without oversight. 7 signatures, Ilsa said grimly, laying the letter on the study desk. Enough to force the hearing under regional law. Not enough yet to force an actual challenge to your crown, but enough to make this considerably more than gossip now. Sophia read the letter twice, her stomach tightening with each pass. The formal language somehow more frightening than the anonymous threats had been, precisely because it carried actual legal weight behind its careful phrasing. "I could withdraw," she said quietly, once Ilsa had left them alone. "Leave the estate, disappear back into whatever life I would have had if I'd never collapsed at your gate. This entire hearing evaporates the moment I'm no longer here for them to object to." No, Matthias's answer came immediate and absolute, no hesitation in it at all. "I won't let 7 signatures dictate who I'm allowed to love. Sophia, I spent 3 centuries building a life around practicality and duty, and the one time I chose something real for myself, I'm not going to abandon it the moment it becomes inconvenient for people who've never once had to fight for anything they wanted. This isn't only about convenience anymore, Matthias. This is your crown, your territories, everything you've spent centuries protecting. Then I'll protect it the way I protect everything that matters to me," he said, by standing in that hearing and making the case for exactly why choosing you was the single clearest act of judgment I've demonstrated in longer than I care to admit, rather than the failure of it they're trying to claim. Preparing for the hearing consumed the following 2 weeks entirely. Ilsa and Matthias poring over precedent, testimony, the accumulated evidence of 3 centuries of careful rule that the Old Bloods faction seemed determined to erase with a single accusation. Sophia found herself drawn into the preparations more than she expected, her ledger work uncovering discrepancies in the estate's territorial contributions that painted a considerably more favorable picture of Matthias's governance than his accusers had accounted for. "You've found something," Matthias said, watching her expression as she reviewed a stack of decade-old agreements late one evening. "I think I have." Sophia turned the page toward him, tracing a column of figures with one finger. 3 of the 7 signatories on that letter have territories bordering yours that benefit directly from trade agreements you renegotiated in their favor 8 years ago. If this hearing forces a change in your rule, those agreements almost certainly get renegotiated by whoever replaces you, likely less favorably for them. Matthias studied the figures, something sharpening in his expression. "You're suggesting their objection isn't purely ideological. I'm suggesting it's considerably easier to dress up self-interest as principle when principle happens to align with your own bottom line," Sophia said. I'm not certain it changes the actual legal argument you need to make in that hearing, but it might change how the council views the motives behind who's making it. That, Matthias said, something like admiration and relief mixing together in his expression, might be exactly the leverage we needed and didn't know we had. Ilsa, brought back into the study to review the discovery, confirmed it within the hour, cross-referencing the trade agreements against council records with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. You're right, she said, looking up at Sophia with something new in her expression, respect edging out the careful assessment she'd offered that first week of Sophia's recovery. This changes the shape of the hearing considerably. It won't dismiss the challenge outright, but it gives Matthias grounds to question the impartiality of at least 3 of the 7 signatories before the council even reaches the substance of their complaint. I didn't expect ledgers to end up mattering this much, Sophia admitted, still faintly disbelieving of her own discovery. You'd be surprised how often they do, Ilsa said. Politics dresses itself up in a great many disguises, but money underneath nearly always tells the truer story, if you know where to look for it. Matthias reached for Sophia's hand across the desk, something warm and fierce in his expression that had nothing to do with the legal strategy taking shape between them. You've been in this house 2 months, he said quietly, and you've already found the exact weakness in an attack 3 centuries of my own experience somehow missed. I meant what I told Lord Vane. Sophia, you are the furthest thing from unremarkable I've ever encountered. Save the compliments for after the hearing, Sophia said, though she couldn't quite keep the pleased flush from rising in her cheeks. We still have considerable work left before any of this actually matters in front of the council. Fair enough, Matthias said, though he didn't let go of her hand, and the 3 of them worked long into the night, building the case that would decide, in front of every powerful bloodline in the region, whether the life they were building together would be allowed to continue at all. The council chamber for the Eastern Territories was larger than the one Sophia had glimpsed in stories about Matthias's own court, a vast circular room ringed with tiered seating that filled steadily through the morning with representatives from bloodlines she'd never heard named before this month, all of them murmuring among themselves, in low, curious tones as she and Matthias took their place at the center floor. The 7 signatories sat together near the front, led by a severe, silver-eyed man named Aldrich, who had, Ilsa's research revealed, the most direct financial stake in seeing Matthias's rule challenged. He rose first, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's careful acoustics. We gather today not out of malice toward the Lord of the Western Territories, Aldrich began, but out of genuine concern for the stability this region depends upon. Matthias has, by his own admission, abandoned a treaty marriage 6 months in the making, for an attachment to a human woman with no bloodline, no standing, and no claim to the kind of judgment this council expects from those who hold power over our territories. Murmurs rippled through the tiered seating, and Sophia felt Matthias's hand find hers briefly beneath the small table where they sat, steady despite the weight of dozens of assessing eyes. We do not ask that Matthias be stripped of his crown today, Aldrich continued. We ask only that this council formally examine whether his current judgment remains sound enough to continue governing without oversight, given the unprecedented nature of his recent decisions. When Matthias rose to respond, the chamber quieted with the particular attentiveness reserved for a speaker whose reputation preceded him considerably. I won't waste this council's time disputing the facts, he said. I did cancel a treaty marriage. I did choose, publicly and without apology, to build a life with a human woman I met when she collapsed from hunger at my gates. I stand by both of those choices completely. Then, you concede the substance of our concern, Aldrich said, something satisfied entering his tone. I concede the facts. I dispute entirely that they demonstrate compromised judgment. Matthias's voice carried steadily through the chamber, and Sophia watched him with a swell of something that felt, despite the danger of the moment, remarkably like pride. I would ask this council to consider something Aldrich has conveniently left out of his framing. 3 of the 7 signatories on this challenge hold territories whose trade agreements I renegotiated 8 years ago, agreements considerably more favorable to them than the terms my predecessor had established. Any change in my rule, forced through this hearing, or otherwise, would almost certainly see those agreements revisited by whoever inherited my responsibilities. I would ask the council to weigh how much of today's principled concern is genuinely about my judgment, and how much is about preserving arrangements that happen to benefit these 3 signatories directly. The chamber went very quiet, and Aldrich's composed expression cracked, just slightly, something calculating flickering behind his silver eyes. "That is a serious accusation," Aldrich said carefully. "It is a documented one." Matthias gestured, and Ilsa stepped forward with the folder of agreements Sophia had uncovered weeks earlier, presenting them to the council's presiding elder with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. I invite this council to review the figures themselves before deciding whose judgment truly deserves scrutiny today. The presiding elder, an ancient silver-haired woman named Theodora, who had said nothing throughout the proceedings until this exact moment, took the folder and studied it with unhurried care, while the entire chamber waited in a silence, so complete Sophia could hear her own pulse in her ears. "These figures appear accurate," Theodora said finally, setting the folder down with deliberate precision. "Aldrich, do you dispute them?" Aldrich's jaw tightened, the composed authority he'd walked in with visibly fraying at the edges. "The figures may be accurate. That does not mean our concerns about the stability of Matthias's rule are invalid. Perhaps not," Theodora allowed, "but it does mean this council must weigh your concerns, knowing that at least 3 of the voices raising them stand to benefit financially from the outcome you're requesting. That is not nothing, Aldrich, whatever the genuine merit of your broader argument might otherwise carry." Sophia felt Matthias's hand tighten around hers, the smallest fraction, the only outward sign of how much tension he was holding beneath his composed exterior. "I would also note," Theodora continued, turning her attention now to Sophia directly for the first time, "that this council rarely hears from the human woman at the center of such a serious challenge. Miss Sophia, is it? I would hear your own account of these events, if you're willing to offer it." Sophia's heart hammered, but she rose from her seat steadily, aware of every eye in the chamber turning to fix on her at once. "I collapsed from hunger outside Lord Matthias's gates on the afternoon of his wedding," she said, her voice carrying more clearly than she expected, given how loudly her pulse was pounding. "I didn't ask him to carry me inside. I didn't ask him to cancel his marriage, or offer me a position managing his household, or tell me, weeks later, that he loved me. Every choice that followed my collapse was his, made with full awareness of exactly what it might cost him, including, apparently, this very hearing." "And what would you say to the accusation that your presence here demonstrates poor judgment on his part?" Theodora asked. "I would say that judgment is usually measured by outcomes, not by how comfortable a decision makes the people watching from a distance," Sophia said. "Since I arrived at this estate, I have helped correct years of disordered accounts that left his territories more financially sound than they were before. I have watched him negotiate a peaceful resolution with a family whose daughter he was originally meant to marry, preserving an alliance neither side actually wanted to lose. And I have watched him stand in front of this entire council today and tell the truth about his own choices without flinching, rather than offer this chamber a more convenient lie. I would ask this council to consider whether that sounds like compromised judgment, or simply judgment this chamber isn't accustomed to seeing exercised so openly." The chamber remained silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, Theodora inclined her head, something that might have been the beginning of respect settling into her ancient, unreadable expression. "This council will deliberate," Theodora announced, rising from her seat with the unhurried authority of someone who had presided over considerably more dramatic proceedings than this one across several centuries. We will reconvene at sundown with a decision. The hours between the morning's testimony and sundown stretched longer than any wait Sophia had endured since the days she'd spent wondering whether her next meal would arrive at all. She and Matthias retreated to a private chamber the council had provided, Ilsa pacing near the window, while Matthias sat unusually still, his composure from the hearing giving way, in private, to something closer to genuine worry. "You did everything right," Sophia said, sitting beside him, her hand finding his. "Whatever happens now, you told the truth, and you let the evidence speak for itself instead of hiding behind rank or intimidation the way Aldrich's faction did." "I know." Matthias's voice carried an edge of exhaustion he'd kept carefully hidden throughout the morning's proceedings. "I'm less worried about the outcome for myself than I am for what it means for you, if this council decides my judgment truly is compromised. I don't know what protections exist for you if they rule against me, Sophia, and that frightens me more than losing my own crown ever could. Then we face that together, whatever it turns out to be," Sophia said. "I didn't survive a year of starvation and loss just to fall apart now, waiting on a council's decision. Whatever happens at sundown, I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. I would never ask you to." Matthias turned to face her fully, something raw and unguarded breaking through his careful composure. "Whatever this council decides, I want you to know that choosing you was never a mistake, not for one single moment since you collapsed at my gate. If they strip me of my crown today, I'll consider it a fair price for a decision I'd make again exactly the same way, every single time." Ilsa, still pacing near the window, finally spoke, her voice quieter than her usual clinical efficiency. "For what it's worth, in 3 centuries of watching this council deliberate, I have never once seen Theodora incline her head to a human speaker the way she did to you this morning, Sophia. That matters more than either of you realizes right now." The summons came just as the last light faded from the windows, a young council attendant appearing at the door with a formal request for their return to the chamber. Sophia's stomach tightened as they walked back through corridors that felt considerably colder now than they had that morning, the weight of the coming decision settling over all 3 of them in heavy, wordless silence. The chamber had filled again, every seat occupied, the atmosphere considerably more subdued than the charged tension of the morning's proceedings. Theodora waited at the center of the tiered seating, her ancient face unreadable as Matthias and Sophia took their place before her once more. "This council has reviewed the evidence presented today," Theodora began, her voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "The financial interests underlying at least 3 of the 7 signatures on this challenge cannot be ignored, and this council does not consider it appropriate to rule on a matter of governance when the motives behind the challenge itself are so plainly compromised by self-interest." A ripple of reaction moved through the tiered seating, quickly silenced by Theodora's raised hand. Furthermore, she continued, "This council has heard testimony today that speaks considerably more clearly to sound judgment than to its absence. A ruler who tells an uncomfortable truth publicly, who corrects his own household's finances through unconventional means, and who chooses honesty over convenience even when it costs him a carefully arranged alliance, demonstrates precisely the kind of judgment this council should wish to see more of, not less." Sophia felt Matthias's hand tighten around hers, hope and disbelief warring visibly across his face for the first time all day. "This challenge is dismissed," Theodora said finally, "and this council formally recognizes Sophia's presence at Lord Matthias's side as a legitimate matter of his own governance, not subject to further challenge on these grounds. Let this matter be considered closed." The chamber erupted into a murmur of reaction, some of it clearly disappointed, most of it, to Sophia's surprise, sounding closer to relief than outrage. Aldrich rose stiffly from his seat, his expression carefully blank, and offered a formal bow toward Theodora before leading his allies out of the chamber without another word, the weight of their defeat evident in every measured step. "It's over," Matthias said quietly, disbelief still coloring his voice as the chamber began to empty around them. "It's over," Sophia echoed, and found herself laughing, unsteady with relief, the sound catching in her throat somewhere between a sob and genuine joy. "I believe you told me once that immortality gives you a great deal of time to build alliances. I don't think anyone in that chamber expected the strongest one you'd ever build would come from a starving stranger collapsing outside your gate. No one expected it less than I did," Matthias admitted, drawing her close despite the lingering audience of council members still filing out around them. "I'm beginning to think the best decisions I've ever made are the ones I never actually planned for." Ilsa, watching the two of them with something warm finally breaking through her usual composed efficiency, allowed herself the faintest smile. 3 centuries, and I've never seen this council rule so decisively in favor of anything resembling sentiment. You should both be quite proud of yourselves, though I imagine there will be considerably less council drama in the months ahead now that this particular matter is settled. "I certainly hope so," Sophia said, still laughing softly, leaning into Matthias's steady warmth as the last of the chamber emptied around them, leaving nothing behind but the quiet, hard-won certainty that whatever came next, they would face it exactly the way they'd faced everything since that first desperate afternoon at the gate together, deliberately and without apology for choosing each other over everything else the world had expected of them. Instead, autumn returned to the estate a year later, the same roses blooming impossibly along the same trellis where Sophia had once sat beside a pail, exhausted Matthias recovering from the first healing she'd ever witnessed him perform, back before she understood how deeply that garden would come to feel like home. The wedding, when it finally came, was nothing like the ceremony she'd interrupted a year before. No treaty terms, no anxious calculations about territorial alliances, no bride standing rigid in silk while pretending not to notice the groom's distracted eyes. Just a small gathering in the same garden, roses climbing overhead, Ilsa standing witness with an expression of fierce, uncharacteristic softness, and Lord Vane, unexpectedly, seated among the guests with Cordelia beside him, both of them having become, over the past year, something closer to genuine friends than either had anticipated on that tense afternoon Vane first arrived to assess the woman who'd ended his daughter's engagement. "You look terrified," Cordelia whispered to Sophia beforehand, adjusting the simple, unadorned dress Sophia had chosen over anything more elaborate. "I am, a little." Sophia smoothed the fabric with hands that weren't quite steady. "A year ago I was starving on a roadside. Today I'm marrying a king in his own garden. It's difficult to fully believe, even standing here." "Believe it," Cordelia said, something warm and unguarded in her voice. "I spent months resenting you, if I'm honest, before I finally admitted to myself that watching him choose you so completely showed me exactly what I'd been missing in an arrangement I'd convinced myself was enough. You gave me permission to want more than convenience for myself, too. I've since met someone in the Northern Territories who makes considerably more room for that than our arrangement ever would have." Sophia squeezed her hand, gratitude and relief tangled together in a way she hadn't expected to feel toward the woman whose wedding she'd once collapsed straight through. "I'm glad. Truly, the ceremony itself passed in a warm blur. Sophia would spend years trying to fully recall in detail Matthias's voice, steady and certain, as he spoke vows he'd apparently been composing for months, his hand finding hers exactly the way it had that first terrified night at her sickbed, steady and unwavering regardless of what storms surrounded them. When she finally spoke her own vows, her voice carried none of the fear she'd expected, only the same quiet certainty that had carried her through a council hearing, through anonymous threats, through months of learning to believe she deserved a life this soft after so long expecting only survival. "I collapsed at your gate a year ago," she said, starving, exhausted, certain I had nothing left to offer anyone. You carried me inside anyway, and canceled everything you'd built your life around to make room for someone the rest of your world considered unremarkable. I don't know how to properly thank someone for seeing worth in me before I'd learned to see it myself. I only know that I intend to spend the rest of whatever life we build together making sure you never regret carrying me through that gate." Matthias's answer came simple and certain, the same steadiness she'd relied on through every uncertain month since. "I have never once regretted it, not for a single moment, and I never will. You didn't need me to see your worth, Sophia. You simply needed someone patient enough to wait until you were ready to see it clearly yourself." That evening, long after the guests had gone, and the garden had settled into quiet moonlit stillness, Sophia stood at the same iron gate where she'd once collapsed from hunger, Matthias's arms wrapped around her from behind, both of them watching the last of the wedding lanterns flicker out along the path. "Any regrets at all, looking back on everything?" he asked quietly, resting his chin gently against her hair. "Only that I didn't collapse here sooner," Sophia said, laughing softly, leaning back happily into the familiar, steady warmth of him. "Though I suppose everything happened exactly when it needed to. Everything usually does," Matthias murmured, and together they turned back toward the house, toward roses blooming impossibly out of season, toward a life neither of them had ever expected to find waiting on the other side of a gate that had once seemed, to a starving, exhausted stranger, entirely too grand to ever belong to her at all. Inside, Ilse was already extinguishing the last of the candles in the great hall, humming something quiet and unfamiliar under her breath, and she paused when she saw them enter, arm in arm, still glowing with the particular happiness that only survives a genuinely difficult year. "I've watched 3 centuries of arrangements in this house," she said, not unkindly, setting down her candle snuffer. "Treaties, alliances, marriages built on ledgers and territory maps instead of anything resembling actual affection. I confess I didn't expect the one built on a woman collapsing from hunger at the gate to outlast all of them so thoroughly." "Neither did I," Matthias admitted, glancing down at Sophia with an expression she'd long since stopped trying to fully put into words. "I'm considerably more grateful for it than I know how to properly express, even now." "You express it well enough," Ilse said, something almost fond breaking through her usual clipped efficiency. "Go on, both of you. The house will still be standing in the morning, and frankly, so will all the paperwork this wedding generated, which I intend to leave entirely for tomorrow." Sophia laughed, the sound carrying warm and easy through the quieting hall, and let Matthias lead her up the same staircase she'd once climbed on trembling, starved legs, barely able to trust her own strength. Tonight, she climbed it steadily, certain of every step, certain of the man beside her, certain in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be certain of anything in longer than she could remember, before that desperate afternoon at his gate. Behind them, the candles burned low in the great hall, and outside, beyond the iron gate that had once seemed like the entrance to a world she'd never be permitted to enter, the roses continued blooming quietly into the autumn night, exactly the way they had every single night since the day a starving, exhausted stranger first collapsed there and found, against every reasonable expectation life had taught her to have, that she had finally, truly, and completely arrived home, welcomed and wanted and utterly, permanently hers to keep.